Hello and welcome. My name's Ben Judah. I'm a senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council in Washington, DC. And thank you so much for joining us here today for the launch of our new report by Rory Stewart, the former UK Secretary of State for International Development and senior fellow at the Jackson Institute at Yale University. Rory's report is The Afghan Refugee Crisis, How to Resurrect the Global Refugee Resettlement Coalition. We've got a fantastic panel here to discuss this today. I'm delighted to be joined not just by Rory himself, but by Dr. Ursula Nemat, a research associate at SOAS in London and a leading think tanker from Afghanistan. And from my side of the Atlantic, the Right Honourable Ratna Umidvar, Senator for Ontario and member of the Standing Committee on Human Rights in the Senate of Canada. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for the launch of this report. So I'd like to begin with a question to Rory. Rory, why did you write this report?
Well, thank you very much. And firstly, thank you so much to the Atlantic Council for putting so much energy and time into helping work with us on this report. Essentially, Afghanistan now finds itself in the core of the most extreme crisis. And this is the result, essentially, of a triple betrayal. The departure of the United States and its allies, of course, handed Afghanistan to the Taliban. That has now been compounded by a situation in which many people, female judges, for example, human rights defenders, journalists, now find themselves vulnerable to persecution from the Taliban, and that situation has been made even worse now by a humanitarian catastrophe where nearly 9 million Afghans find themselves on the edge of starvation. But the message of the report is it is not too late to act. The international community has, in fact, a very proud tradition stretching back to the response to the Vietnam boat people in the 1970s and early 80s on how a global coalition could be brought together for exactly this kind of crisis. And this is a particular opportunity because Afghanistan uniquely has connections to the US and its allies, which other countries tragically often don't have. That's partly because 2 million internationals served in Afghanistan during the intervention. Many people have personal links, and you could see during the evacuation the extraordinary outpouring of small contributions from citizens, amazing contributions from entrepreneurs. For example, Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn, contributed to planes to evacuate people, actions from NGOs, international NGOs like the Open Society Foundation, that extraordinary work, not only identifying some of the most vulnerable, also placing them in countries around the world. All of that shows that the goodwill is there. And we now have an opportunity for the US and its allies to step up, a unique opportunity, because I believe responding generously and well to the extraordinary challenge of refugees from Afghanistan is in the interests of all of us. It's an opportunity for countries like Canada, which have been leading in the generosity of their response to refugees, which is why we're very, very lucky to have the Senator with us today, but an opportunity also for leading Scandinavian countries to show how much they're doing. It's an opportunity for Germany as the chair of the G7. It's an opportunity for the European Union, in particular after the serious challenges of 2015, to demonstrate again its moral leadership globally, an opportunity for Australia and Britain to show that they're serious about resettlement, and above all, an opportunity for President Biden and the United States, an opportunity to recover US moral leadership at a difficult moment following Afghanistan, a moment to show that President Biden can fulfill his commitments to overturn President Trump's refugees and asylum policies, follow through on his commitment to raise the ceiling, and demonstrate through US leadership that this is a burden that can be shared. Show US voters from across the political spectrum, whether they are more traditional Republican voters who are veterans, who are very concerned about Afghanistan, or voters, more progressive voters from the left who are concerned about refugees and asylum seekers in different ways, demonstrate all these different constituencies that the United States can show global leadership and share the burden fairly around the world. So what this report calls on is for these countries to come together to convene under Canadian or US or German leadership a conference with the aspiration of committing to take 0.05% of the domestic populations in refugees annually. To put that in context, that is slightly less than Canada is currently taking. It's approximately what the United States is taking. It equates to, in a town of 10,000 people, perhaps 5 Afghans, an Afghan family in a town of 10,000 people. It's eminently doable. And I think this should be part of a much broader response on refugees, which should also involve these countries committing development funds to develop asylum systems within other countries and use the Afghan crisis as an opportunity to create a much broader resettlement coalition to deal with other crises around the world as they emerge. These countries that we've been talking about, these democracies, have had a very proud tradition stretching back to the first responses after the horrors of the Second World War, through the Korean War, through the Vietnam boat crisis in the 1970s and early 80s. And this is an opportunity, particularly at a moment of isolationism and populism, to demonstrate renewed confidence, legitimacy, ethical leadership, and above all, to save hundreds of thousands of the most vulnerable people on earth.
Rory, thank you so much. I'd like now to pass the floor to Dr. Ursula Nemeth and ask her, how does this humanitarian catastrophe look for the people of Afghanistan and for the Afghan diaspora around the world?
Thank you very much, Ben. Good evening or good morning, everyone. First of all, let me thank the Atlantic Council for organizing this panel, and also thank Mr. Rory Stewart for preparing this report in a very timely manner, I would say. The humanitarian crisis that we are facing today and how people are seeing it from within the country is a type of a humanitarian crisis that has man-made factors and also natural disasters. So over the last year, if we specifically talk about this very last final year, just before now, Afghanistan experienced a dramatic situation. The first half of the year, the situation in terms of violence was record-breaking in 20 years. Afghanistan has never been so violent, with such violent conflict level in 20 years when it experienced the situation between January and August last year. At the same time, the country was suffering from a very severe level of drought, which affected people's economy. We are a rural society. Most of the country is mostly relying on agricultural resources and rain land. And this situation really caused also lots of difficulties. So all this happened in the time where Afghanistan, as part of the global society, was also experiencing the global pandemic of COVID-19 that also directly affected. So besides the whole political turmoil that we have experienced, the people of Afghanistan suffering from severe level of drought, suffering from severe level of conflict, have experienced things that were man-made, a regime change, taking over of the country by a new group that is not recognized by the international community. Okay, now from a group like Taliban, maybe the expectation is so. But from the international community, the expectation was not to immediately halt the entire development aid and assistance to the country. So with the collapse of banking system, with the collapse of aid and development assistance, the country is practically pushed into this level of poverty that we are experiencing today. People who are probably more modest, following a modest type of lifestyle, or middle class, or with small and medium enterprises, are all affected regardless and pushed into severe level of poverty below the internationally recognized poverty line. So under this situation, what really needs to be happening and how the diaspora part, I'll just come back to it, but really now, what needs to be done? This is not the first time that Afghanistan is experiencing war. In my lifetime, over the last 4.5 decades, at least this is the third time or fourth time in some senses, if you say, that we have been in the same place as we have now. So the key messages from the Afghan perspective here is to learn from the experiences of past. I, as an Afghan, has a similarly, friends of Afghanistan, such as Rory and others, are fulfilling their human responsibility and asking for humanitarian assistance and aid for refugee quotas, as Rory in this excellent report is talking about. But at the same time, we should remember that at the end of the day, Afghanistan needs skilled people who can build their own countries. For the longer term, that's the vision that everyone holds, despite the situations and turmoils that we see today. So migration is a basic and fundamental rights of anyone. And with regime changes, it's very normal that some people will not feel fit and they choose to leave the country. They leave the country today from Afghanistan. They leave because they don't feel fit with the harsh regime that was just until a day before taking over the country, were blowing themselves and many, many civilians up. It's very hard and difficult for people to accept ruling them until there is a level of trust being built. And secondly, people are, the vast majority are deciding or choosing to leave the country because there are no possibilities or opportunities left for them. So in this very critical time, what needs to be done, the call for humanitarian assistance, the call for distribution of food aid or emergency assistance as we do, has to be something which is temporary and just feeding people now. We are a young country. Afghanistan's population is over 65% of the population are considered youth. This over 65% are skillful. They have the potential to be educated, to be skilled, and to have the opportunities to work. And so there will have to be, side of the larger humanitarian programs, has to have the development orientation or development aspect, which brings these people opportunities to work in order to make livings and in order to build their countries, but also in order to survive in this very dramatic situation. For those who are leaving the country, and I have said this several times, it's every individual's choice to really stay or to move on or leave the country. Our diaspora also is a very mixed groups. Those who have already left and the fresh comers, I would say, in the West particularly, most of us are in a situation that is very difficult for us to accept that we are part of the diaspora community and not part of the activists from the ground in the country. We no longer live there. Those who specifically live here with a refugee status. There is options for them to immediately return back to Afghanistan or probably non-existent or very limited. So for the countries here, acceptance is one huge step to have this quota system that at least people arrive here without waiting, particularly the younger generation, waiting for a long, long period of time. The refugees also, or those who are leaving the diaspora communities, are also important in terms of the local economies within the country. If a young person from a family leaves, comes here, gets educated, learns skills, send some remittances, some funds back to home, it can also save lives there and creates a more kind of a sustainable living conditions for people. And the burden of tax-paying money there will be less because people will earn because of working and not earn because they are starving from hunger. So in sum, I can say it's really critical to learn from the lessons of the past. We have been there. I have been a refugee in a refugee camp for 14 years. I lived in Pakistan, and I have seen that free food rations are not a long-term solution. So yes, for now we need that, but UN and many other international agencies have to really be very critical of the approach that they are following and not create this environment where everyone will have to receive free food rations. This has to go to those who are in the most vulnerable situation, and there has to be job creation opportunities. For those who are leaving, as I mentioned, I think it's critical to note that particularly the younger generation who are arriving here, there has to be intensified educational and skill training programs for them so that they become a healthy parts of the societies within the countries or communities that they live, and also when they return back in Afghanistan. We would not need refugees who are angry, who are discriminated against, who return out of anger and join more sort of radicalist type of groups in the country. Because the opportunities in a country like Afghanistan, with the situation and the crisis that we are existing now, will be very difficult to survive in a situation like that. So I will probably stop here by concluding the part of the diaspora's role. As I earlier mentioned, the new diaspora particularly, are in the very unclear phase of learning where they are and how they can really help. There is a lot of traumas, there is a lot of anger for good reasons, and sometimes probably for reasons that needs a lot of reflection. And the role that they can play is also very important. Our desire and hope is that this role is more constructive and is contributing to a longer term and sustainable peace and tranquility in Afghanistan, and not fueling different kind of hostilities. And we've seen this kind of different phase migration in the past, creating such kind of environment within these diaspora communities, but also have been affecting inside the country situation. So with this hope, I will end here and let you to continue the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nemat. I'd now like to pass the floor to the Right Honourable Ratna Omidvar, Senator for Ontario, with the question, Canada's played such an important role in refugee resettlement now for a long time. Could you tell us a bit about what Canada's doing, how Canada could do more, and how Canada could potentially lead a push for what Rory has outlined in his report?
Thank you so much. And I want to commend Mr. Stewart and the Atlantic Council for this very timely impetus to address this growing crisis. Before I start with Canada, I'm actually going to go back a bit in history and remember in 2016 when President Obama exercised the leadership in convening a pledging summit at the UN. And if I remember correctly, 52 countries and international organizations participated in this event. I was on the sidelines, and the financial contributions that were pledged, the refugee numbers that were pledged were incredibly encouraging. I don't know if all the pledges actually ever were realized, but I like to look back on history, and I like the mantra, if we have done this before, we can do this again. So from that point of view, I really do welcome Mr. Stewart's impetus for this conversation. So getting back to Canada, Canada, we all know, leaves a larger footprint in the refugee context because of our unique history, population, geography, etc. We still think of ourselves as a country that's in the process of nation building. And our refugee intake for this year alone, which was, by the way, announced just yesterday, will be close to 77,000. That takes us way beyond the 0.05% proposed by Mr. Stewart. And I think it's good to have ceilings and floors. And I hope we are the ceiling and not the floor, the 0.05%. I imagine Mr. Stewart wants it to be considered as a floor. We have promised to take 40,000 Afghans over the next few years. And we are doing that through a number of strategies. There's, of course, our true and tried resettlement program with the cooperation of the UNHCR and others. We're also working very closely with the United States on cross referrals, and obviously with NGOs. We've developed special measures to provide refugee status to journalists and other human rights defenders who have been caught up in all of this. And I think this is an expression of Canada's, not just Canada's compassion, but our admission of some culpability in all of this. We were in Afghanistan. We had troops stationed there. Local Afghanis worked as translators, interpreters, lawyers, advisors to our to our mission. And whether we like it or not, they are now the victims of potential oppression because of their association with us. Former veterans of the Canadian Armed Forces are at the forefront, urging our government to extract those who are still in danger. And we're very much in the conversation around securing the security of Afghan human rights defenders, including female judges, etc. So adding an additional 0.05% to the top of what we already do would take us close to 100,000 refugees a year. I personally don't think that is impossible, but I do not believe our government will likely be on the same page at this point. But what is important to note about Canada, I think, is that we are very aggressively deploying non-refugee pathways to residents to accommodate the huge demand from Afghanistan. This includes granting labor market visas for residents to those individuals who are refugees but meet our labor market needs, international student visas. There's a huge demand from Afghan students to study in Canadian universities. There are temporary residents, and there's, of course, an extension of potential family reunification criteria, which could see extended families reunited. These are proposals, but I believe proposals worth considering. And I would suggest that a solution to the world's refugee crisis should not be exclusive of other legal pathways. And the refugee resettlement numbers are not the only tools in our toolbox. One of Canada's greatest contributions in the refugee context is the innovation of private sponsorship, where groups of Canadians, 10, 15 or more, come together and sponsor refugees, which means they look after their needs and settle them in the country for at least a year, if not more. I have been part of such a sponsorship team. We have a sponsorship team of roughly 15. We call ourselves Team Everest because it's like climbing a mountain. And we have collectively settled more than 20 Syrian refugees. It is, I will tell you, the best thing I have ever done. And as senator, I get to do a lot, but I will say it gives me the goosebumps when I visit the Syrian refugee family. They're citizens, they've bought a home, they have jobs, they vote in elections, etc., etc. So along with the target of 0.05% of population as a resettlement figure, I think it's worth examining whether it's possible at a proposed summit to put a similar target for private sponsorships in host countries, because it leaves it just not up to the government, but it engages citizens in a very interesting and successful public-private partnership. I welcome the call for a summit such as this. And the question is what role Canada can take and should take. As a middle power, Canada, along with other countries such as Sweden, I believe we are uniquely positioned to grab onto an idea like this. In addition, I will point out that Canada is the home to a new global institute whose aim is to further multilateral and regional solutions to the refugee crisis. It is called the World Refugee and Migration Council, of which I'm a proud member. And it calls for exactly what Mr. Stewart's report calls for. It calls for a new focus on responsibility sharing. We have forgotten those two words in the convention, responsibility sharing. It was never, ever going to be only left up to neighboring countries to deal with the refugee outflows. And we have been closing our eyes to the situation that countries like Kenya, Bangladesh, Pakistan find themselves in. So we need a new protocol to the 1951 convention that outlines exactly what such a responsibility sharing protocol would look like. In addition, I believe, and I would love to have a discussion about this, that we need multilateralism, but we also need mini multilateralism, such as the arrangements that are being made very creatively around the Venezuelan refugee crisis, with Colombia and other countries in the lead. A summit such as the one proposed would kickstart all these conversations. So Canada has the reputation. we have the institutional heft and a proven history of success to either lead or co-lead such an effort. But I speak as an independent senator. I do not speak for the government.
Thank you so much. I'd like to now bring the discussion back to Rory with a question actually about the UK. You know, what is the British government doing right now? Is it doing enough? Where can we go further, and where are we falling short?
So I'm afraid the UK is very much not doing enough. The UK is by comparison with this extraordinary account that Senator Omivar has given of Canada, and indeed actually the commitment by President Biden, who's lifted the refugee ceiling in the United States from very, very low level under Trump, where only a few thousand people a year were coming in, to 165,000, is a significant gesture. Britain has committed to take 20,000 vulnerable Afghans, but has so far not actually brought the scheme into fruition. And 5,000 a year, which is what it equates to for a country with a population of 70 million, is very, very few people indeed. So given that Boris Johnson is looking to restore Britain's place in the world, he talks a lot about global Britain, talks about Britain providing moral leadership, being a responsible multilateral player. Here is an opportunity for something quite interesting, I think, for a country like Britain. Not least because in this case, particularly with resettlement directly from Afghanistan, it gives countries like the United Kingdom, and to some extent other countries like Australia too, that come from similar political directions, to actually make sure that they can reassure their population the people they're taking are genuinely vulnerable, that they are female judges, that they are journalists, that they are people who are human rights defenders, that they are people who are at genuine risk of persecution. Because at the core of this proposal is a resettlement proposal where the most vulnerable Afghans identified by credible NGOs on the ground, international and local NGOs on the ground, would identify the most vulnerable people, and they would move directly from Afghanistan to the host country, which could be the United Kingdom. And it's open to countries to choose who to prioritize. Countries can choose to prioritize women, they can choose to prioritize LGBTQ campaigners. And I think to some extent this flexibility is important, because although I want people to sign up to an aspiration of taking 0.05% of their population annually, the more flexibility there is, the more voluntary this is, the more likely we are to get many countries to sign up. Because the lesson, unfortunately, from Europe in 2015 is an attempt to impose a target on countries failed.
Thank you so much, Rory. So now I'm going to kind of open up the discussion to questions from our fellows and audience, which will be submitted to me via the Q&A function we've got, and they'll be sort of shared around the panel. So the first question I've got from one of our fellows is to you, Dr. Nemat. Are there any optimistic trends in Afghanistan, or is it all pessimistic?
Thank you, Ben, and thank whoever asked this question. Look, with a country like Afghanistan, being in war for over 4 decades, if an Afghan becomes pessimistic, that means the end of that person, and that means the end of Afghanistan. So no matter how dramatic the situation turns, as I said earlier, we experienced several phases of the similar situation as we are facing today. There is a long-term optimism that things will change. It's impossible. Afghanistan has changed so much. We've had tremendous level of problems in the last 2 decades. I have been an active player in my own way of leading humanitarian organization for women and children from 1999 all the way till 2007. Later on, I joined different international and national organizations working in different fields, development fields. And in the later phase of my own life, I worked as a researcher and entered the world of academia. So across all these phases of my personal experiences, I have seen very different situations. And I have also observed how our people, our communities have changed. And the very old mindset, and I'm reminded here by one of the very highly respected late Afghanistan scholars, Mr. Louis Dupree, who once said that Afghanistan's mud walls that are surrounding Afghan villages, and Rory will probably understand this better in terms of writing the book that he did in the past. Louis Dupree is talking about these mud houses that are surrounding the Afghan villages as a form of privacy and not letting the externals enter inside Afghanistan. This is Louis Dupree in the 1960s writing about Afghanistan. The mud walls are completely like protecting the outsiders to insiders, very metaphorically sort of a situation where there is not much relations between the country and the outside world, outside in the sense of a village outside and outside in the more national, international and regional senses. Look, what in the last 40 years we have seen is that Afghanistan's not only the country, not only the subnational provincial, the Afghan villages became the front for international competitions, for international wars, and for international interventions of all kinds, not only the military intervention, but all kinds of cultural, social, economic, political, everything. The result is quite significant and is quite different from what you will see. So the country, 30 to 40 million population is estimated, is now no longer the same country of the 1960s or 70s, or even 2000s to say it. This country cannot live under very harsh restrictions. I believe the current regime is also realizing that slowly. It may take time, but eventually they will realize, and eventually I'm optimistic there will be a way to sort of see situation out of what we are going through. But this is a very critical phase. And I think the fact that Rory is emphasizing about the most vulnerable groups' safety and protection, probably there is not much objection about that, because if the current ruling regime, the Taliban, are not able or doesn't have the capability of protecting these high-risk people, it's probably good for themselves as well to facilitate that, which we don't see much, but at least there has to be more welcoming hands from the outsides to accept the most vulnerable groups for asylum purposes. So the answer is long-term optimism, short-term challenges, and with a hope to see and make this short-term challenges more shorter. Thanks.
I've got an audience question for Rory, which is, do you see your policy as a form of immigration? Do you see your policy as a form of refugee compromise between the left and the right, between open borders and the non-admittance of Trump?
Yes, I do. This is a policy. I mean, I'm somebody who's a working politician, so I'm trying to be as politically realistic as possible. There will be people, potentially even on the call, who believe in completely open borders. And in fact, one of the interesting things as you get involved in conversations about refugees is you realize there are a very strong group of people who object to the whole idea of any form of border control. I don't think that that is a realistic position in relation to domestic voters. And it encourages very strange, disturbing forms of behavior, often, unfortunately. I think it makes sense to try to set ambitious targets, as Senator Omidbar has said, to get countries to think about the numbers that they can genuinely absorb and look after. And it's extremely impressive. I mean, Canada is showing, of course, with that 70,000 number, that you can take a very considerable number. Of course, in an even more extreme level, of course, Germany taking in 1 million Syrian, mostly Syrian refugees, and actually, in a very short order, absorbing them far more easily than many people predicted, is another example of the extraordinary things that can be done. But if you can combine that with some form of reassurance to the public that systems are being put in place to try to ensure that the people coming are the most vulnerable, I think that makes a huge difference. It's of course true that much of the opposition in Europe and the United Kingdom to Afghan refugees is driven by a perception from the population that many of the people coming are young men and that there's an unfairness in it, that these are people who are able to make the trip and who are lucky enough to be able to make it to the borders of Europe. To be able to say that through this resettlement, we will genuinely be trying to reach out to people and work with NGOs to identify people who are the most vulnerable. Right? Afghan female judges is a very obvious example of that. But there are many, many other examples. We can see already who is vulnerable in Afghanistan. And I think finally, Afghanistan is an unusual situation because it's a situation where it's possible to resettle people from inside Afghanistan. That isn't always the case. In many countries, you might think that the fact that someone can technically leave the country means that they're not really at risk of persecution. That is never true. Remember that Nazi Germany allowed Jews to leave Germany at earlier periods. That didn't mean they weren't at risk of persecution. And indeed, the decision by the Swiss government to return those refugees to Nazi Germany led to their deaths. But we do have a window now in Afghanistan where the Taliban are generally prepared to permit people to leave. The reason they're not leaving is that the borders with Pakistan and Iran are effectively closed. The borders with Central Asia are basically closed. And above all, because countries in the West are not prepared to receive them. If countries say, if the United Kingdom would come forward and say, this list of 10,000 people are welcome to come to the United Kingdom, the chances are the Taliban would let them leave. But that is not likely to be the case forever. Right? We can't assume because that's the case now, it's going to be safe just to assume that people can remain forever.
So I've got another kind of audience question, which is, what could an American, British or Canadian individual hope to do to help Afghan refugees? What can an individual do? So maybe we'll go to Canada to start this question.
Well, that's a big question. There's so much one can do at an individual level. I mean, you can help Afghanis who are still in Afghanistan. There are efforts underway by various jurisdictions to provide them with food and shelter. As we all know, the United Nations Food Program is never going to have enough money to feed the hungry and cold Afghanis. And I want us to remember it's very cold over there. People are very hungry over there. So in the first line, keeping them alive, I think is a very worthy individual effort. It doesn't change the system, but it helps someone in a difficult situation. At another level, I know that in the United States and in the UK, the sponsorship program that I spoke of has been replicated in small ways in different parts of the country. And both the United Kingdom and the United Kingdom, at least, has brought in sponsored refugees from Syria and other places. And I'm pretty sure that the system would allow for the sponsoring of Afghan refugees as long as the government of the United Kingdom plays ball and has a stream dedicated to this number. The United States program is very, very new. It's called a community sponsorship program. I really don't know too much about it, but I'm happy to, Ben, send you further information if this individual so desires. It's actually not that difficult to plug into these groups of people. And I should say that whilst historically, sponsors have come from religious communities, the Mennonite churches, Anglican churches. Today, the new wave of socializing has shown me, at least, that dog walking clubs and book clubs and mom and pot gathering places are fertile places to start the conversation about sponsoring refugees.
And if the questioner is an American, there are an enormous number of organizations which can be found quite quickly, very, very impressive organizations. I mean, for example, where I teach at Yale in New Haven, Connecticut, there's an extraordinary organization called IRIS, which has been leading on this. But these organizations exist in many, many towns and cities across the United States. And it's really wonderful. I mean, Afghan friends of mine turning up in New Haven after a very difficult journey. And remember, one of the things that we haven't talked about is many Afghans are still stuck in limbo. I have friends who are still in the US military base in Doha. and who still haven't been able to move. They've been there since August. One friend in particular who, because she wasn't moved early enough, now has a baby coming due in a week and therefore won't be able to move and will have to give birth in a tent in a US military base. But by the time you've arrived in the United States, these communities will often, particularly with these well-organized groups in places like New Haven, meet people at the train station, will have already helped to organize housing for them, which works with the rental allowance they get from the US government, have talked to schools to make sure that they can take the children, have organized collections for them, etc. So I would encourage people who are interested to reach out. And I think, again, the Senator is absolutely right. Senator Omidvar is absolutely right to point to Canada's lead on this. The community sponsorship bit is really important, not just practically because it takes the burden off the government, but because it gives the public legitimacy. It allows the public to feel that they are involved in the project, they own the project. This volunteering is really important in keeping the public on side. So apart from the fact it's often a very efficient, loving, and effective way of working with refugees, it's also good politically. It's a smart thing to do to try to embed refugee resettlement to have this Canadian system.
And I should just add to that some of the Syrian refugees who were sponsored to come to Canada in 2016 are now members of sponsoring teams helping Afghan refugees come to Canada. So the paid forward magic in this is incredible.
If I may also add here, Ben, one
Please.
Additional point. Definitely, I appreciate the idea of community sponsorships. This is really important in terms of, the social integration of Afghans arriving here. The experience with the last 6 months in terms of, people arriving, even in the UK, where I'm currently staying, I noticed that many families are still living out of hotels, basically, and not completely settled. So a more community sort of orientation will help and probably put less burden on governments to really take care of this in a sense of solidarity. But I also have to emphasize on another aspect. We were earlier talking about, the identification, and Rory, you were talking about NGOs helping in the identification of the vulnerable groups. There is a mindset in Afghanistan that there is not a single person, educated or not educated, rural or urban, who will not feel that they are not qualified to leave the country and be in the United States or be in Paris or in London or anywhere. And I give them full rights. I, as an Afghan myself, cannot prefer people to come to Europe because of their economic or socio-cultural or socio-political or even religious status of who they are. So it has to be more in terms of a vulnerability assessments. Who is really at risk of losing their lives? Are they at risk because of not being able to work with the current system in form of regime, or are they at risk of hunger? So to address the hunger part, people, any individual from the United States to Canada to the UK and elsewhere can just find a family and sponsor them. And I have seen this happening quite in an incredible way. Most of the Afghans in diaspora are already active in this. Most of the friends of Afghanistan in diaspora are already as well working on sponsoring families back in the country. And that helps really. The organizations need to really do a little additional than individual work, which means to connect those who are in very far and remote areas with limited access to also benefit from these family and household sponsorships. Because what the world particularly doesn't want is a flood of economic migration. And it's very natural for people to arrive for the reasons I earlier mentioned. So an individual contribution to reduce economic migration is also important. And for example, in the UK, I'd like to mention about Afghan Aid, a very long term dedicated British charity that has worked and is still continuing to do a tremendous job in the country, reaching out to families. So please, if you're a UK resident or even internationally from anywhere, continue to support the efforts of Afghan Aid, to which I have to also say I'm a trustee. And there are thousands probably of organizations similar to that. I see MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, I see IRC, many other organizations similarly doing the same excellent job. So the need is really enormous. There are also, I really appreciate the point Honorable Senator Omidwar, you made about the importance of quotations or at least allowances for educational visas. These are very critical. I found, because, you know, I have to be very sort of operational, there are at least, 100 people, 100 girls list in my hand. All of them either completely finished their high school, completely like waiting for the period of, entering the university without any clearance about the future destiny. Some half of their BAs or bachelor degrees, some in the process of getting their master's degrees. Because these girls cannot immediately leave the country due to the limitations that were mentioned, in addition to that, due to not having passports, because not all Afghans had their passports in their pockets, and there are no passports in the country to offer them, despite some rumors that they are open. So we found online opportunities for English languages, for international studies, and many of these girls that I have been working with are already enrolled in these online classes. So I think these kind of initiatives are also really important, because the goal is not to only like to remove the entire population out of the country. The goal is to really select those who really are in need of leaving, because there isn't much space left for them to stay, but also to help those who stay behind but have a dignified and respectful life until the things get more reasonable and more clear. Thank you.
I've got one question from my fellows for Rory, and then there's a question from the Honourable Senator Omidwar to Rory. Question I got coming from inside the House is, could you tell us a bit more about these historical precedents that you think could be deployed, that you've written about in the report, to take action now for Afghanistan?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the first thing is to understand that it's strange that countries like the United Kingdom and, to some extent, Australia, and even recently the United States, have stepped away so much from something which has been, since the Second World War, almost the hallmark of ethical international action. The entire process, of course, begins from the horror of the discovery, in particular, that the Swiss were turning back refugees from Nazi Germany at the border, and the beginning of these coalitions in the late 1940s, beginning of the 1950s, were attempts to ensure that people who faced genuine risk of persecution were able to leave countries rather than be persecuted within those countries. The most impressive examples were Hungary in the 1950s, and then after the Vietnam War. And one of the reasons that I've focused a lot on the example of the Vietnam War is that there are many analogies between Vietnam and Afghanistan. In both cases, the United States and its allies left very suddenly. In both cases, their very sudden departure handed the country over to the people that they had been fighting, and left the communities with whom they were working very, very vulnerable to persecution by the new government. In both cases, decades of involvement had created strong personal bonds between foreigners and people within the country. But by the late 1970s, the Vietnamese expatriate population in neighboring countries were in a terrible situation. And people will remember the horrifying stories of boat people and their journeys to try to get to Australia and to Indonesia during this period. In many ways, it was actually the courage of individuals like Richard Holbrooke, who pushed administrations to make big commitments and then to create an architecture which by the early 1980s was really beginning to share the burden between countries like Canada, United States and Australia, and indeed countries like France, to take in a community that has gone on to be one of the most successful immigrant communities. And again, another great example for Afghanistan, the speed with which a very large number, in that case, over 1 million Vietnamese were integrated into Western countries over that period. And the success that people have made of their lives should prove a really good example of what could happen with Afghanistan. So it's a wonderful opportunity. There is incredible historical precedent. But I think the thing that I wanted to focus on, just sort of concluding this point most of all, is that we are facing a crisis of legitimacy from the West. But it is certainly true that we are entering an era of isolationism and populism worldwide. The reputation of the United States and Europe is not what it was 20 years ago. There is a lot of suspicion internally and externally towards these countries. And producing a genuine, generous, clear, predictable process of refugee settlement year in, year out will, I think, help to restore some of the reputation of these countries after a very difficult period.
Thank you. So we're fast running out of time, coming up to the hour. So I'd like to pass the floor very briefly to the Honourable Senator Omidvar for, I believe, a question to Rory.
Yes, please. Dying of curiosity here. First question, what has been the response of the UNHCR to your report? And secondly, what role do you see for wealthy non-receiving countries, Saudi Arabia, Japan, Korea, the UAE? What role do you see for them in this responsibility sharing?
Thank you, Senator. Okay, so UNHCR cautiously interested, but always cautious. So I think we need to do more work on UNHCR. The bigger question, though, is a fascinating one because it is really striking that the number of countries that actually take refugees is remarkably limited. Sweden has taken more refugees than countries with a combined population of nearly 3 billion people. There have been years when years in which Liechtenstein and Luxembourg have taken more refugees than the whole of Latin America. Wealthy countries like China take no refugees. Wealthy developed countries like Japan take tiny numbers. And so you're absolutely right that this is very oddly, anachronistically, feels still very much like a coalition of the old, inverted commas, West. And it's a bit embarrassing. Why is it that the lead on refugee resettlement really is being taken by Europe, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand? So now that's different, of course, from neighboring countries. There are huge strains on neighboring countries, and we shouldn't underestimate the strain on Iran and Pakistan, or the strain on countries like Uganda, dealing with refugees from, for example, South Sudan. But it is certainly true that there are many very wealthy countries out there, Japan, China, many of the Middle Eastern countries, who, if they're not prepared to take refugees themselves, could at least make a financial contribution.
We're almost out of time. So I'd like to firstly just thank all of our panelists today. Thank you, the Honourable Ratna Omidvar from Canada and Canada's Senate for joining us and sharing our expertise. Thank you to Dr. Ursula Niemat for all of the kind of knowledge you kind of brought to this. And thank you so much to you, Rory, for writing this report and launching it with us here at the Atlantic Council. If you want to kind of read the report or download it, the report has now been posted live. And we really look forward to having you all back for future events on this topic here at the Council. Thank you and goodbye.